I'll give the floor to Mr. Christopher Lockyer.
Madam President, Excellencies, colleagues. As I speak, more than 1.5 million people are trapped in Rafah. People violently forced to this strip of land in southern Gaza are bearing the brunt of Israel's military campaign. We live in fear of ground invasion. Our fears are rooted in experience. Just 48 hours ago, as a family sat around their kitchen table in a house sheltering MSF staff and their families in Khan Yunis, a 120mm tank shell exploded through the walls, igniting a fire and killing 2 and severely burning 6 others. 5 of the 6 injured were women and children. We took every precaution to protect the 64 humanitarian staff and family members from such an attack by notifying warring parties of the location and clearly marking the building with an MSF flag. Despite our precautions, our building was struck not only by a tank shell, but by intense gunfire. Some were trapped in the burning building, while active shooting delayed ambulances from reaching them. This morning, I am looking at photos that show the catastrophic extent of the damage, and I am watching videos of rescue teams removing charred bodies from the rubble. This is all too familiar. Israeli forces have attacked our convoys, detained our staff, bulldozed our vehicles, hospitals have been bombed and raided, and now, for a second time, one of our staff shelters has been hit. This pattern of attacks is either intentional or indicative of reckless incompetence. Our colleagues in Gaza are fearful that as I speak to you today, they will be punished tomorrow. Madam President, every day we are witnessing unimaginable horror. We, like so many, were horrified by Hamas's massacre in Israel on October the 7th, and we are horrified by Israel's response. We feel the anguish of those families. We feel the anguish of families whose loved ones were taken hostage on October the 7th. We feel the anguish of the families of those arbitrarily detained from Gaza and the West Bank. As humanitarians, we are appalled by violence against civilians. This death, destruction, and forced displacement are the results of military and political choices that blatantly disregard civilian lives. These choices could have been, and still can be, made very differently. For 138 days, we have witnessed the unimaginable suffering of the people of Gaza. For 138 days, we have done everything we can to enact a meaningful humanitarian response. For 138 days, we have watched the systematic obliteration of a health system we have supported for decades. We have watched our patients and our colleagues be killed and maimed. This situation is the culmination of a war Israel is waging on the entire population of the Gaza Strip. A war of collective punishment, a war without rules, a war at all costs. The laws and the principles we collectively depend on to enable humanitarian assistance are now eroded to the point of becoming meaningless. Madam President, the humanitarian response in Gaza today is an illusion. A convenient illusion that perpetuates a narrative that this war is being waged in line with international laws. Calls for humanitarian assistance have echoed across this chamber. Yet in Gaza, we have less and less every day. Less space, less medicine, less food, less water, less safety. We no longer speak of a humanitarian scale-up. We speak of how to survive even without the bare minimum. Today in Gaza, efforts to provide assistance are haphazard, opportunistic, and entirely inadequate. How can we deliver life-saving aid in an environment where the distinction between civilians and combatants is disregarded? How can we sustain any type of response when medical workers are being targeted, attacked, and vilified for assisting the wounded? Madam President, attacks on healthcare are attacks on humanity. There is no health system to speak of left in Gaza. Israel's military has dismantled hospital after hospital. What remains is so little in the face of such carnage is preposterous. The excuse given is that medical facilities have been used for military purposes, yet we have seen no independently verified evidence of this. In exceptional circumstances where a hospital loses its protected status, any attack must follow the principles of proportionality and precaution. Instead of adhering to international law, we see the systematic disabling of hospitals. This has left the entire medical system inoperable. Since October the 7th, we have been forced to evacuate 9 different health facilities. 1 week ago, Hazare Hospital was raided. Medical staff were forced to leave despite repeated assurances that they could stay and continue caring for patients. These indiscriminate attacks, as well as the types of weapons and munitions used in densely populated areas, have killed tens of thousands and maimed thousands more. Our patients have catastrophic injuries, amputations, crushed limbs, and severe burns. They need sophisticated care. They need long and intensive rehabilitation. Medics cannot treat these injuries on a battlefield or in the ashes of destroyed hospitals. There are not enough hospital beds, there are not enough medications, and not enough supplies. Surgeons have had no choice but to carry out amputations without anesthesia on children. Our surgeons are running out of basic gauze to stop their patients from bleeding. They use it once, squeeze out the blood, wash it, sterilize it, and reuse it for the next patient. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza has left pregnant women without medical care for months. Women in labor cannot reach functional delivery rooms. They are giving birth in plastic tents and public buildings. Medical teams have added a new acronym to their vocabulary: WCNSF. Wounded child, no surviving family. Children who do survive this war will not only bear the visible wounds of traumatic injuries, but the invisible ones too. Those of repeated displacement, constant fear, and witnessing family members literally dismembered before their eyes. These psychological injuries have led children as young as 5 to tell us that they would prefer to die. The dangers for medical staff are enormous. On a daily basis, we are making the choice to continue working despite the increasing risks. We are scared. Our teams are beyond exhausted. Madam President, this must stop. We, along with the world, are closely watching how this council and its members have approached the conflict in Gaza. Meeting after meeting, resolution after resolution, this body has failed to effectively address this conflict. We have watched members of this council deliberate and delay while civilians die. We are appalled by the willingness of the United States to use its powers as a permanent council member to obstruct efforts to adopt the most evident of resolutions, one demanding an immediate and sustained ceasefire. 3 times this council has had an opportunity to vote for the ceasefire that is so desperately needed, and 3 times the United States has used its veto power, most recently this Tuesday. A new draft resolution by the United States ostensibly calls for a ceasefire. However, this is misleading at best. This council should reject any resolution that further hampers humanitarian efforts on the ground and leads this council to tacitly endorse the continued violence and mass atrocities in Gaza. The people of Gaza need a ceasefire not when practicable, but now. They need a sustained ceasefire, not a temporary period of calm. Anything short of this is gross negligence. The protection of civilians in Gaza cannot be contingent on resolutions from this council which instrumentalize humanitarianism to blur political objectives. The protection of civilian infrastructure, of health workers and health facilities falls first and foremost on the parties to the conflict. But it is also a collective responsibility, a responsibility which rests with this council and its members as parties to the Geneva The consequences of casting international humanitarian law to the wind will reverberate well beyond Gaza. It will be an enduring burden on our collective conscience. This is not just political inaction, it has become political complicity. 2 days ago, MSF staff and families were attacked and died in a place they were told would be protected. Today our staff are back at work, risking their lives once again for their patients. What are you willing to risk? We demand the protections promised under international humanitarian law. We demand a ceasefire from both parties. We demand the space to turn the illusion of aid to meaningful assistance. What will you do to make this happen? Thank you, Madam President.
It did not matter if we had seen the Israeli attack, including the shooting of unarmed Palestinians. It did not matter how many witnesses we interviewed. It did not matter what photographic and forensic evidence we obtained. Israel lied. Small lies, big lies, huge lies. These lies came reflexively and instantly from the Israeli military, Israeli politicians, and Israeli media. They were amplified by Israel's well-oiled propaganda machine and repeated with a cloying sincerity on international news outlets. Israel engages in the kinds of jaw-dropping lies that characterize despotic regimes. It does not deform the truth, it inverts it. It paints a picture that is diametrically opposed to reality. Those of us who have covered the occupied territories have run into Israel's Alice in Wonderland narratives, which we dutifully insert into our stories, required under the rules of American journalism, although we know they are untrue. Israel has invented an Orwellian lexicon. Children killed by Israelis become children caught in the crossfire. The bombing of residential districts with dozens of dead and wounded becomes a surgical strike on a bomb-making factory. The destruction of Palestinian homes becomes the demolition of the homes of terrorists. The big lie feeds the two reactions Israel seeks to elicit: racism among its supporters and terror among its victims. The big lie fosters the myth of a clash of civilizations, a war between democracy, decency, and honor on one side, and Islamic terrorism, barbarism, and medievalism on the other. The big lie abolishes nuances, ambiguities, and contradictions that can plague conscience. The big lie allows believers to take comfort, a comfort they are desperately seeking, in their own moral superiority.
Shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024/173 please raise their hand? Those against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 13 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council.
主席女士，中方对刚才的决议草案投了赞成票。我们对决议草案遭到美国的否决表示强烈不满和失望。阿尔及利亚代表阿拉伯国家提出决议草案，要求在加沙立即实现停火，立即释放全部人质，保障人道物资准入，反对强制转移。这既是形势的紧迫需要，也是基于人道最起码的要求，理应得到安理会所有成员的支持。 阿尔及利亚展现出理性、真诚、开放的态度，就决议草案同各方进行长时间、广泛的磋商，采取了许多建设性意见，让草案内容更加平衡。今天的表决结果清楚说明，在加沙停火止战问题上，不是安理会没有压倒性共识，而是美国行使否决扼杀了安理会的共识。美国的否决释放了错误信号，把加沙局势推到了更危险的境地。正当安理会停火决议被否决时，加沙的无辜百姓正在战火中丧命，正在死亡边缘挣扎。美国声称安理会决议会干扰正在开展的外交努力，这种说法是完全站不住脚的。当前形势下，在立即停火问题上仍然消极回避，无异于为继续杀戮大开绿灯。正当安理会停火决议被否决时，冲突外溢正在使整个中东地区动荡不安，更大范围的战争风险正在上升。只有熄灭加沙战火，才能防止吞噬整个地区的地狱之火。安理会必须尽快采取行动，阻止这场中东浩劫。正当安理会停火决议被否决时，国际法的底线正在遭到践踏，多边体系基石正在遭到侵蚀。联合国秘书长已经援引宪章第99条致函安理会，国际法院也发布了临时措施，对于加沙冲突中严重违反国际法和国际人道法的行为，安理会必须予以有力回应，维护国际法治的权威。主席女士，安理会必须采取行动，推动实现停火。这不应该是一个还需要争辩的问题，而是安理会不容推迟的道德义务，是安理会必须承担的法律义务，更是安理会履行联合国宪章的政治要求。否决不能掩盖停火止战的强烈呼声，安理会维护正义、履行职责的脚步不会因此停顿。中方敦促以色列倾听国际社会的呼声，取消对拉法的进攻计划，停止对巴勒斯坦民众的集体惩罚。我们期待有重要影响的国家少一些政治算计，真正秉持公正和负责任态度，为推动加沙停火做出正确选择。我们呼吁国际社会汇聚一切外交努力，给加沙民众活下去的机会，给整个中东地区人民拥有和平的机会，给伸张正义一个机会。谢谢主席。
Then one would say, well, but they're our only ally in the Middle East. Let's stop and talk about that little pronoun our. What do you mean by that our ally? Is Israel my ally? Is Israel Steven Anderson's ally in the Middle East? Okay, is Israel the ally of Faithful Word Baptist Church in the Middle East? Okay, is Israel just going to bat for Arizonans in the Middle East? What does that mean? They're our ally. You know what they really mean is that they're the ally of the U.S. military in the Middle East. Well, let me explain something to you. I don't give a rip about the interests of the U.S. military in the Middle East, because the U.S. military has no business being in the Middle East. We should be defending ourselves and not nation building and empire building all over the world. So what you really mean is that Israel is a great ally of the military-industrial complex. Our ally in the Middle East, are they the ally of righteousness, godliness? No. What does that mean, our ally? Why do we need an ally in the Middle East? Who are they our ally against? I don't think they're our ally in the Middle East. I think we're their ally in the Middle East. They're the one who has all the enemies around them. Sounds like we're their greatest ally. I don't see how they're our ally. I don't think we need them. I think that this friendship is a little bit one-sided. I think that we would just as soon just cut this friend loose. Now they sure need us. We don't need them. You know what? You know what we are to them? We're their whore. We are their whore. We are their prostitute. Okay? And they have as much respect for us as a man has for his prostitute. We are the concubine of Israel at best. Okay.
Greater Syria was a major region of the Middle East at the turn of the 20th century. It became part of the Ottoman Empire in 1516 and remained Ottoman until the end of the First World War in 1918. Greater Syria's southern province, Palestine, was an active part of the Ottoman world. Trade boomed in its commercial centers, which included Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Haifa.
فلسطين كان فيها شعب نشيط فعال منتج مفكر مبدع.
But the First World War changed everything. In November 1918, the Allied powers of Britain, France, Italy, and Japan defeated the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and importantly, the Ottoman Empire. Britain and France conspired to divide Greater Syria to their best advantage. But they could not agree on the future of Palestine. So in 1920, the League of Nations put it under interim British control or mandate. Some Christian and Zionist Jewish writers describe Palestine as, quote, a land without a people.
منذ قرنين وأكثر والحركة الصهيونية المسيحية غير اليهودية ابتدأت قبل الصهاينة اليهود بالادعاء إنه فلسطين لا يوجد فيها أحد، شراذم بدو، شراذم فلاحين، لا يوجد شعب ولا يوجد حضارة، لا يوجد زراعة، والإزاء والأخبار أنه لا يوجد شيء في فلسطين يستحق الذكر. هذا سبق حتى مولد هرتزل هذا الكلام.
But this film looks at the region in the 20th century from a different perspective. Here, historians and personal testimony by contemporary witnesses argue that, far from being an empty wilderness, Palestine was a vibrant Arab country with a developing commercial and community infrastructure. This is the other side of the Palestinian story.
Palestinian society in 1920 was a society in transition. It was the period of globalization that had led in the last quarter of the 19th century to a degree of development, certainly in the cities, Jaffa, Haifa, and to some extent Jerusalem.
Jerusalem was becoming an important commercial center, as were the ports of Gaza and Jaffa. They combined to turn Palestine into a trading hub with Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. These old trading records in the Jerusalem archives are evidence of its business activity. Jerusalem exported soap to Egypt, Italy, and Greece through Gaza, grain to Egypt, Rhodes, and Dubrovnik through Jaffa, cotton to France and Izmir, and antiques and religious gifts to Istanbul, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. Gaza and Jaffa also imported rice and fabrics from Egypt, textiles from Istanbul, glassware from China, shawls from India, and lead from France and the Netherlands in Europe. Through trade, Palestinian cities kept pace with developments in the rest of the world in the late 19th century. Palestine also developed a transport infrastructure and built a railway network to connect Jerusalem and other towns and cities with the ports on the Mediterranean. The opening of Jerusalem's main train station was a landmark event in this part of the Ottoman world.
افتتاح محطة رئيسية للقطارات في فلسطين في مدينة القدس يجب أن نعود إلى الوراء إلى آخر القرن ال19 تحديداً 1892. كان في الواقع حدثاً لا ينسى. جاء من الأستانة يعني من إسطنبول وفد يمثل الحكومة العثمانية على أعلى المستويات، وصل إلى القدس، وكان أيضاً طبعاً المتصرف، وكان أيضاً جميع السفراء والقناصل المتواجدين في مدينة القدس. والمدينة بأعيانها بعائلاتها، البسط، السجاجيد، كلها موجودة، وأيضاً الأطعمة والشراب للجميع كان متوفراً، والناس بالانتظار 3 ساعات والجميع ينتظرون. طبعاً ازدهرت فلسطين، يعني اتصل الساحل، اتصل بالمدينة بالداخل، وتعززت التجارة، وكل هذا أدى إلى ازدهار شامل بفلسطين. وطبعاً صار في قطارات أماكن أوسع بعد عن القدس ويافا، توسعت في فلسطين، وصار في قطارات مع إلى مصر إلى آخره، مع الشام أيضاً إلى آخره.
Israeli professors' research, Israeli textbooks show Palestinians, or Arabs as they're called, as caricatures of primitive farmers, hordes of refugees, or they're masked and painted as terrorists.
You cannot find one photograph of a human being who is a Palestinian. And since they never or hardly ever meet Palestinians face to face or speak to them, although they may live 50 to 100 meters from them, this is what they know.
If you type map of Israel in Hebrew into Google, this is what you'll get. Notice how a lot of these maps have no clear markings showing the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, all of which are internationally recognized as illegally occupied Palestinian territories. You'll also find this map in Israeli textbooks. It's how you end up with illegal settlers colonizing more and more Palestinian land. Students in Israel are taught about the Holocaust starting in nursery school all the way to the 12th grade. Part of that learning is looking at horrifying images, or exercises that encourage students to put themselves in the shoes of the victims and relate to the experience. The identification of students with the victims isn't a coincidence. It's an intentional policy by the Israeli Ministry of Education. It's how you end up with a society where, according to one Israeli professor, every Jewish Israeli citizen is a Holocaust survivor or a potential victim of future Holocaust-like events.
The goal is traumatization and revenge, and not to let the fire of vengeance die out. However, this vengeance is not directed towards the German persecutors and their collaborators in Europe, but towards Palestinian colonized subjects who are Nazified.
The fact that Palestinians had nothing to do with the Holocaust and that they are the ones currently being exterminated seems to be irrelevant. With this weaponization of the Holocaust, Zionism isn't seen for the settler colonial racist ideology that it is, but as the savior of the Jewish people. And it's this thinking and this fear that is weaponized to justify the violence of the Zionist state. Israelis spend 12 years in this education system, teaching them to dehumanize Palestinians and see them as people looking to eliminate Jews, not an oppressed, colonized people looking for freedom. And once they graduate, most Jewish Israelis will go straight to the military to do their 2 to 3 years of mandatory service, where they become the front lines of apartheid and occupation.
How do you take nice Jewish boys and girls and turn them into monstrous killers of children when they reach 18? It takes a very long, thorough, and sophisticated education to do that. And that was my question, How do you do that? How come, And we have an organization called Breaking the Silence, where soldiers confess what they did in the West Bank. And in many of these confessions, the soldiers say I was educated to believe that whatever I do to the Palestinians will save us from another Holocaust. And only when I aimed my rifle at a little girl, I realized that I was the evil one. And then I stopped. So this education is so entrenched. It's really, you know, Richard Dawkins hated religion, and he called religion mind infection. But I think this is mind infection. Ideologies can be mind infected. And they are so infected with it that and the dehumanization of Palestinians especially is so strong that it's very hard for people, especially young people, to get rid of that and to see these people as human beings.
And talk about what you did as an Israeli soldier and your change of heart.
Yes, thank you, Amy, for having me, and thank you for the work that you do. So I was raised in a very, I would say, extremely Zionist family, but also very common way of being raised in Israel. I have a lot of war heroes in my family, fallen soldiers, Lehi recruiters, Air Force commanders, and the like, Mossad agents. And as the child of my father, I was recruited into the Air Force. And after 6 months of serving, my base was moved from Tel Aviv to the south. This was 2002. And I was asked to send planes to fuel planes that were going into Gaza, to bomb Gaza. I was raised extremely Israeli, which was also meant that I wasn't raised very Jewish, which is also a very common thing. The way that the assimilation into Israeli identity happened within my lineages was to really like remove the Jewishness and really become this like tzabar, heroic IDF soldier identity. From that merging, you know, the Zionist identity, a part of that propaganda is to really hold it within the cage of anti-Semitism. Like every time that we criticize Israel, someone can say you're anti-Semitic, but in reality, there's nothing anti-Semitic about criticizing Israel. We are not causing it, and we will not undo it. And the only thing we can do is to continue to resist it. And at the same time, what Israel is doing right now has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. What Israel is doing right now is a genocide. What Israel has been doing for the past 75 years is apartheid, is occupation. The techniques that are being used in the West Bank are clearly apartheid techniques that have nothing to do with anti-Semitism.
אתם תמשיכו לרעוב, תמשיכו למות, הבתים שלכם ימשיכו להישרף, הילדים שלכם ימשיכו לחיות בבוץ ובניילון, עד שאחרון החטופים לא בא לכאן חזרה.
כן, אנחנו אומרים שאנחנו רוצים לקחת להם אדמה, לקחת להם את השטח ולהתיישב, כי רק ככה הם יבינו שניצחנו אותם. לא מעניין אותם הבתים, לא מעניין אותם ההרוגים, לא מעניין אותם שום דבר חוץ מהאדמה.
אני לא מרחם על העזתים האלה. אני לא חושב שיש מישהו במדינת ישראל, בארץ ישראל, שצריך לרחם על העזתים האלה. לא על מבוגרים, לא על קשישים, לא על צעירים ולא על ילדים. העזתים, מבחינתי שירעבו למוות, מה אכפת לי מהם? למה צריכים שיהיה לנו אכפת?
If someone raised their hands, I didn't take captives. How many people do you think you killed this way? They asked this guy. I didn't count. And he laughs. I can't really know. This guy's, listen to this. He grabbed a woman, young and good looking, went into a house, prepared a bedroom, and wanted to F her. The girl came back half dead like a rag. One guy raped a 16-year-old girl or something of the sort, this guy says. They're all kind of laughing and smiling as they say this too. But they're all giggling. He's giggling about them raping a 16-year-old.
If you watch,
and that's what I was told Hamas did and why I'm supposed to hate them. But apparently their country was founded on this, and they're all giggling about it. So watch. You understand? But this is very ugly. Oh, really? As you laugh. There was one guy, he passed away. He was a savage, he says. He just took them and murdered them in this enclosure. You know, surrounded by barbed wire. All the men were rounded up. They were all sitting on the ground. And someone comes and takes a machine gun and starts and then reloads the cartridge. What do you think? And some guys took flamethrowers and ran after people and incinerated them.
He's smiling.
He's smiling and laughing. It was horrifying. It's forbidden to tell. I'm not going to talk about it because, well, you are talking about it. He goes, listen, war is war. That's how they all just justify all this. Not everyone can know what war is.
Did we have a Nuremberg trial about this? What is and isn't war?
That doesn't sound like war to me. War is when you're actually fighting against another soldier. This sounds like you're just slaughtering civilians. And I say whoever wasn't there can't judge anyone else. I'm pretty sure we can.
Well, I mean,
that is, if you can watch that and still support Zionism, you're a special kind of evil.
الدكتور محمد كان مع الدكتور محمد أبو سلمية فوصف لي كيف بيعامله. محمد أبو سلمية كسروا إيديه ثنتين هو بيمشي زي الحيوانات على الأربع. حاطين سلسلة بركبته وجبروه قدام الناس. لما بدهم يطعموه لمحمد أبو سلمية بيجيبوا له صحن. بياكل زي الكلب قدام كل الناس. هاي الإنسانية اللي بيتعامل فيها مع الأطباء. طبعا لما يدخل معتقل الأطباء هناك في يصير كلاسيفيكيشن. يكون الناس العادية والأطباء. الأطباء ينكل بهم. الدكتور يوسف حكى عن عدد شهداء من الأطباء. هم هناك يستهدفوا العقول. البلد هناك وصلت إنهم هدموا الشجر والحجر.
Which was found on the body of one of those sadistic villains. It's Al-Qaeda material, official Al-Qaeda material. We're dealing with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Hamas. This is what we're dealing with. And in this material, there were instructions how to produce chemical weapons. It speaks about...
This material was found? Are you sure it wasn't printed out? I mean, I'm not accusing you of anything, but it sure does look like material that was just, well, printed out online. But you guys wouldn't do that, though. Israel wouldn't do that. No. And when you showed this blurred picture, I just had to double check it. I had to make sure that this wasn't printed out online. So you do your best to unblur it, and then you reverse image search it. And I came up with somebody else's PowerPoint, like slides discussing terrorism. This person's slides, Dr. James Forrest, where he discusses, what do you know, chemical weapons. But on slide 20, it has a similar image in the top left when you compare it to this one. Why wouldn't you want us to see what the evidence is? Is it because you printed it out? No. You guys would never do such a thing. In summary, this whole Group H chemical weapons thing, well, it's just more propaganda, atrocity propaganda. You make up a big lie so you can have an excuse to go and, well, commit more genocide. Why would Group H print out a cover of a book, just a cover of a book from 2010 and use that in 2023? Just the cover of the book. They just have it randomly on them? Why? And they just mixed and matched it with Dr. Forrest's slides? What is the logic here? This doesn't make any sense.
Let me preface these remarks with I never, ever believe Israeli figures. I've been in the government too long to know that the Israelis are patent liars. In their intelligence community, in their propaganda community, certainly, and in their leadership, they are inveterate liars. Let me say that again. They are liars. So you can't believe anything that comes out of Jerusalem. It's all propaganda.
Israel, like all settler colonial projects, including our own, was founded on lies. The lie that Palestinian land was unoccupied. The lie that 750,000 Palestinians fled their homes and villages during the ethnic cleansing by Zionist militias in 1948 because they were told to do so by their leaders. The lie that it was Arab armies that started the 1948 war, that saw Israel seize 78% of historic Palestine. The lie that Israel faced annihilation in 1967, forcing it to invade and occupy the remaining 22% of Palestine as well as land belonging to Egypt and Syria. Israel is sustained by lies. The lie that Israel wants a just and equitable peace and will support an independent Palestinian state the lie that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, the lie that Israel is an outpost of Western civilization in a sea of barbarism, the lie that Israel respects the rule of law and human rights. The brazenness of Israeli lies stunned those of us who reported from Gaza.
Live on Channel 5, this is the 10 o'clock news with Deborah Norville.
Coming out revealing secret negotiation between the Nazis and the Zionists in 1933, which allowed German Jews and their assets to go to Palestine. Rich Samuels joins us tonight with the story of the controversy behind the book and the author's struggle to write it. Rich?
Deborah, with the rise of Adolf Hitler to power in the spring of 1933, the Jews of the world were faced with a dilemma. They could raise a cry of protest, a cry few would heed, or they could make a deal with Hitler, a deal that would bring a step closer to their dream of an independent Jewish state.
American Jews marched calling for the boycott of all German exports. Jews throughout Europe echoed that call, so did Jews everywhere.
A group of Zionists at the same time was quietly negotiating an agreement with the Nazis to allow the immigration of German Jews and the transfer of their assets to Palestine. That deal, reported in August 1933, was the transfer agreement. Palestine, sparsely settled by Jews at the time, was radically changed as a result.
I lived in Palestine from 1933 to 1936, and we saw every week transports of German Jews coming to settle in Palestine.
German Jewish settlement of Palestine was, for a time, official Nazi policy. These photos of Jewish life in Palestine, along with a lengthy text, appeared in 1934 in the Berlin paper Der Angry. A Nazi Visits Palestine was the title of the multi-part series. A medal was struck by Goebbels in commemoration. On one side, the swastika. On the other, the Star of David. Hitler demanded one concession for the transfer agreement, that the call for a boycott of the Reich, raised by Jews here and elsewhere, be rejected by the Zionists. The Zionists made that concession.
And so, while Nazis were marching in Germany, and while Jews were marching here, diplomacy was running a more important story. In the Mediterranean, where the dream of a nation-state for Jewish people came a step closer to reality. The story in this book some will find hard to accept.
You've never been told what the origin of Nazi is. NA is National Socialism, which was the German Nazis. And in 1923, there was a double agent who came to Hitler, and he said to Hitler, look, your Nazi party is not, your National Socialist Party is not getting off the ground. You need an alliance. And he suggested that they ally with the Zionist Party. So the NA of National Socialism joined with the Zionist Party in the World Zionist Party in 1923, and ever after was known as the Nazis, NAZI. The ZI was for Zionists, but of course no one knew that, because our popular mythology is that the terrible Nazis were attacking the Jews. But what we were never told is there was a great schism in the Jewish community of the world between the Zionists and the non-Zionists. You see, the non-Zionists were the Orthodox Jews who believed you could not have a Jewish state until the Jewish Messiah came. They didn't acknowledge Christ as Messiah, so they were waiting for their own Jewish Messiah to come. Then you would have a Jewish state, and that Jewish state would rule the world. But the Rothschilds in 1828 decided they couldn't wait for the Jewish Messiah, so they started what they called Reform Judaism under Moses Hetz. And Reform Judaism said, yes, you can have a Jewish state before the Messiah comes. And the reason you could have it was the Rothschilds had made so much money, they said, we'll buy our own state. So the Rothschilds sent people out to the Middle East to have Jewish settlements, and which is today the state of Israel, totally created by the Rothschild money. And so Reform Judaism then became the cause of a great schism between Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews. Now, no one has ever told you this, I'm sure, but you think that the Jewish community is monolithic. In fact, it's split sharply down the middle. But even today, they have riots in the Jewish parliament between the Orthodox Jews and the Reform Jews. And they cannot agree on anything because the basic premise is a fundamental disagreement over whether a Jewish state should even exist today. So in Germany in 1923, the German Jews were quite prosperous and quite happy, and they were not interested in becoming Zionists, and they were not interested in going to Palestine. After all, they had beautiful mansions in Germany, they had symphony orchestras, they had art, they had everything, and they were accepted in the community. As Ezra Pound said, Germany was the least anti-Jewish country in Europe. When you went over to Poland and Russia, you had very strong feeling against Jews. But in Germany, they were accepted and happy, so why would you ever have an anti-Jewish government in Germany? And of course, Hitler, allying himself with the Zionists, he said, after all, you're right. He said, we have the same goals. And so he allied with the Zionist party, and the mission of the Nazis was to force the anti-Zionist Jews to accept Zionism. And this is what the concentration camps were about. They put the anti-Zionist Jews in the concentration camps, and they were placed under the direct administration of the Sonderkommandos, who were the Zionist Jews. Well, what happened was, in 1945, after the German military was defeated, they brought in the German leaders, the German generals, at the Nuremberg trials, tried and convicted and executed. They had to execute them because they didn't want them around to testify that about the alliance between the Nazis and the Zionists. So they had to die, and they were executed for that reason. But they were executed, and so the Zionist secret was safe. And now the Zionists were now in command of the world.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?